host Carter, and in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the the attack that really brings World War II into full swing. So, as you may know, we're doing a podcast series on World War II in maybe a week or so, and I thought this would be a good kind of way to ease into it, because as many of you may know, it is December 7th, the day I'm recording this, and probably the day I'm uploading this as well. And it is the 76th anniversary of the Battle of Pearl Harbor, or, as some might put it, really, the unprovoked attack, or ambush of Pearl Harbor. And this is definitely one of those turning points in world history that historians and common folk alike debate about to this day, the effects and all around just everything that surrounds this battle, I'm going to call it, and even that is controversial. Everything surrounding this event is pretty much controversial, no matter which way you look at it, because there are things that basically everybody has their own opinion of what either side should have done. Some people argue that the U.S. should have done this, that, and the other thing, as opposed to what they had done, or that the Japanese should have done something differently. It really, all around, is just a very polarizing subject for the populace at large, and is still debated to this day, even among the few remaining survivors of the Pearl Harbor attacks that were there that day. And just about everybody and their mother knows that at least somebody who has some relation to somebody that was there at the Pearl Harbor attacks. It's almost like the 9/11 attacks nowadays, where everybody just kind of remembers it. Though, of course, now because the 9/11 attacks are more recent, most people have an easier time of tracing back kind of a relation to that event as opposed to Pearl Harbor, but there still is that kind of ability, even to this day, 76 years later, for people to kind of like connect themselves back to this cataclysmic event in history. And so today I'm gonna possibly go over it I'm definitely not going to be going over Pearl Harbor in such detail in the regular podcast series because of time constraints. If I'm gonna be running an hour-long podcast over trying to cover all of World War II, right? For each, even splitting it up into like 20 episodes, I'm still not going to be able to cover individual battles in such detail as this. So I figured, since this was such an interesting topic to study and to learn about and all that, that I'd just kind of, on the anniversary, just give it a little bit of a introduction for those of you who haven't really read much into it. And so today, even though I list my sources down in the description, I'm just going to say this, and this is not sponsored whatsoever. One of the greatest books ever written on the Pearl Harbor attacks is Day of Infamy by Walter Lord. I happen to have a copy here right in front of me, and it is just one of the greatest accounts of the battle that I've ever read. And I'm sure that some people who have read it, because it's such a controversial topic, the attack on Pearl Harbor, that some people probably disagree with Lord on some of the stuff that he says, which is completely fine, right? Because it's an author. He is entitled to his opinion, you're entitled to yours, and that sort of thing. So basically what I'm going to be doing today is stating the facts, maybe giving a little bit of opinion, but, I'm just going to basically just kind of list it out, what happened, and what both sides did, what both sides could have done a little bit better, but I'm not going to I'm going to go more into the history side as opposed to the speculation side, because I believe that it's up to you to kind of read up or listen, if you're, listening to this podcast right now, to kind of research it for yourself and come up with your own opinions. I've read some books on it. I've read a few articles on it. I've talked to a whole bunch of people about it who have read a lot more than I have, and so basically, I'm just gonna give you a little bit of my humble opinion, and then mostly just the facts. So uh, let's just get right into it, and hopefully I don't blabber on too much. So the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the in order to truly understand the idea behind why the Japanese would do such a would take such drastic measures as to ambush the United States, you kind of have to go back a couple years in history. Just kind of see what's going on, see how the political situation is kind of shaping up. And prior to this whole deal with the Japanese attacking the United States, there was actually a lot of back and forth between the Japanese government and the United States government in the years prior to this event that can be traced as, yep, that's the spot right there. You can pinpoint a spot where kind of negotiations broke down, and the Japanese knew that it was never going to be an option to actually negotiate with the Americans to actually try and find a peaceful solution to these problems. And I'd say that that point is when the United States actually declares an embargo for oil and rubber on Japan. Now, Japan prior to this was a growing imperial power. During World War I, they had fought on the side of the Entente, aka what is now considered in World War II the Allies, against the Central Powers, the Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire. And because they fought with the Allies against the Central Powers, they gained a seat at the table at the Treaty of Versailles. And at the Treaty of Versailles, they were basically given all of Germany's Pacific territories. So that would include places like Qingdao in China, although I think China probably got... I think China got Qingdao later on. And then they took places like the Caroline Islands, the Bismarck Islands, all the German island territories out in the middle of the Pacific that you would kind of classically associate with Japan. All those places Japan gets as part of the Treaty of Versailles. And this is kind of this is where the buildup starts happening, right? Prior to this, the Japanese had gone to war with Russia once or twice, and Japan, after being kind of reconciled with the West, after the U.S. kind of moved in, has started really ramping up their imperial ambitions, and this is just verified in World War I when they joined. And over the course, and in the years after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, they continue this. So in the 20s, they start kind of ramping up their military production. Their fleet starts to grow in massive proportions. Their fleet just balloons. They just snowballs out of control. The US, UK, everybody is looking at the Japanese and just is awestruck by the sheer just speed of this Japanese military buildup, which happens in the course of maybe 20 to 30 years, really, from 1900 to 1930. And the powers in the Pacific, so that would be those being the UK and the US, are starting to really kind of get worried about Japan's colonial and imperial ambitions with this growing fleet to back them up. And so, over the course of these interwar years, the US and the UK and Japan are having this naval arms race between the three of them to kind of see who can keep the other in check. And over the course of these pre-war years, they've actually signed a number of treaties dictating what kind of ships they can build, like such as the Washington Naval Treaty, which banned the use of really big weapons. Like, I think something over 16-inch guns was banned. You couldn't build. So basically, this disallowed countries like the United States, the UK, and Japan to build huge battleships like they had in World War I with the dreadnoughts. They couldn't build those anymore. So this actually simultaneously sparked a revolution in carrier design because those were never addressed by the treaty. So these Washington Naval Accords inadvertently to the drastic change between World War I and World War II, between in World War I having huge battles where lines of dreadnoughts exchange volleys with one another, to what you see in World War II, which is carrier groups sending out their planes to launch strikes from hundreds of miles away on opposing carrier groups and that sort of thing. In World War II, you almost never see one group of ships formally engage another in World War I style combat with a gunnery duel. That almost never happens. It's usually the air fleet of one group encountering the air fleet of another group, or like in the Battle of Midway, which we'll cover later in our series, the air groups completely miss each other and bomb each other's fleets and then come back. So this kind of arms race continues over the course of the interwar years, and by the time the mid to late 1930s start rolling around, Japan, with this massive army and navy, starts to actually act on these ambitions. And so Japan invades Manchuria in the mid-30s, and then in 1937 actually declares war on China. And this is what really scares the United States, and Great Britain pretty well too, because if Japan takes over China, one of the main rules of war, right, and most people say this is a joke, but it's completely true, is never fight a land war in China. If Japan manages to defeat China, even though they're a struggling power, China at this point is split up into different military cliques, and they're having a really hard time uniting under one banner to fight the Japanese. If the Japanese can take out China, they have dominance of the Pacific, because Japan will be able to, with the fertile Yellow River Valley and all that, will be able to feed their empire indefinitely. And also, just because now China's not there anymore, they've got a staging point to actually attack British colonies like the British Raj, aka India, or French Indochina, Siam, that kind of area, all is under the immediate threat of Japanese invasion. So the UK and the US, or the UK at the beginning, actually builds the Burma Road to supply the Chinese with stuff. But that's kind of out of the scope of this little podcast here on Pearl Harbor. And the US, in response to this, starts scaling back trade with Japan to kind of lessen their ability. Most of Japan's oil to feed this gas-guzzling fleet comes from United States oil fields. And if the Japanese are not able to trade for oil with the United States anymore, their fleet will just run out of fuel and they won't be able to do anything. Which is what President FDR realizes and decides to persuade Congress to embargo Japan for oil and rubber, which were two of the biggest Japanese imports. And once this happens, the Japanese know that their days are numbered where they can actually operate. And so the Japanese have to start actively planning to either scale back their colonial ambitions and then hopefully negotiate with the United States to get the oil privileges back, or they have to launch an immediate attack of certain strategic places where they can recapture these valuable supplies of oil and rubber, such as the South Pacific, which just happens to be either British colonies or Dutch colonies allied with the British. So places like Borneo, Java, Sumatra, New Guinea, all those places, the Philippines too, all those places the Japanese want to immediately start invading. So the Japanese government orders the military to start creating plans for an immediate invasion of these areas. And Japan, the strategic overview of Japan, right? So the higher up officers, they know that if they attack these places, like Borneo, Java, Sumatra, basically the Spice Islands, right? The East Indies. If they attack these places, the U.S. will go to war. So they have to attack the U.S. simultaneously to make it so that they won't be able to interfere with the Japanese invasion of these islands. Which basically means that Japan, over the course of a month, is going to have to fight and kill everything, or most of everything, in the Pacific in order for them to stand any chance whatsoever against a combined Allied force. And this means attacking the United States fleet. Where is this United States fleet? Well, in 1940, it was in San Diego. But in 1941, the U.S. fleet, because of these rising tensions with Japan, rebases the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Oahu and Pearl Harbor to make it closer to Japan, so that if something happens, it can react quicker. Inadvertently, they put themselves in a spot way more open to Japanese attack. And the Japanese, meanwhile, had been planning to attack San Diego. And then they hear the news about Pearl Harbor and the switch to Oahu. And I'm sure that many Japanese planners were very thankful of this. And if you've ever seen a map, or even let alone been to Oahu, you would know there's only one entrance or exit to Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harbor. And this is both good and bad for strategic reasons. Now, from the eyes of an old naval officer, this is really good. This means that you can bring your fire, the fire of all your battleships and cruisers and destroyers, all the guns can concentrate on that one entrance to the harbor. Now, because of the evolving use of aircraft carriers and the expansion in the aircraft carrier fleets, this also means that if you're attacked by air, there's only one way to get out of the harbor and into open water where you might be safe from air attack. So the old commanders deem it a good idea, the new commanders think it's a bad idea in terms of the US, and the Japanese air commanders are just doing their happy dance because they know that this US fleet is a sitting duck if they can manage to blow the harbor entrance and make it unusable. So, with this in mind, the Japanese start their plan for this attack. They gather a carrier group together with supporting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and start preparing with all the individual squadrons of aircraft, all the targets of interest that they would like to destroy. This includes the battleships to appease the older commanders' interests of wanting to take out the capital ships, and also the aircraft carriers, the United States aircraft carriers. If they destroy this aircraft carrier fleet, they might be able to stand a really good chance of actually beating the United States in a pitched naval engagement. So, they draw their targets, and they have these Japanese fighters. In Japan, they actually construct a mock Pearl Harbor. I think it was downsized a bit from the actual, so it was scaled down, but they actually construct a mock-up of Pearl Harbor and have the Japanese fighters fly over this Pearl Harbor at a lower altitude than they would be if they were flying a normal combat mission, so that it looks the same size almost as it would when they're actually flying over Pearl Harbor. And they practice doing bomb runs and all this stuff, of course with phony weapons, but they practice doing all this stuff over this mock-up of Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, the squadron commanders back in the planning rooms have access to unprecedented information of the island of Oahu, the Japanese, due to the spies that they have, because there were actually a lot of Japanese people living in the Hawaiian Islands at this time, so the Japanese spies have managed to feed information and maps to the Japanese High Command of everything that's going on in Oahu. And the Japanese managed to build these huge maps, taped like 10 feet by 10 feet, of the island of Oahu, and with the latest information are plotting points on this island, on this mock-up island that they've created the map of Oahu, are plotting the points where the U.S. has radar stations, fighters, where the battleships are, where the cruisers are anchored, where the aircraft carriers are anchored, all this stuff. And they get all this information, and every time something changes, they're always adapting the battle plan. So that every day, if they get the order to go, they're always ready for whatever the eventuality is. And they've got backup plan A, B, C, D, E, you name it. And whatever's there, even if they weren't expecting that kind of configuration of ships, they've got everything planned out. If the battleships are gone, heck, they'll still do it. If the carriers are gone, they've still got a plan. Any eventuality, they've got a plan prepared. Meanwhile, the Japanese diplomats are still negotiating in Washington, just kind of fruitlessly trying to get this oil back, just to kind of keep up the facade of them actually wanting a peaceful solution. And so, meanwhile, the U.S. is completely... The Navy knows that an attack is imminent, but they don't know where, they don't know when, most importantly, and also, they don't know what the Japanese are going to bring. And they can't actually go out on maneuvers and try and intercept the Japanese fleet without actually going to war with the Japanese, even if unintentionally just running into them. So, basically the U.S. command, the Pentagon, all the Navy staff, are just kind of waiting there. And it's never a good position. You never want to be, as a commander, in the position of having to react to any enemy decisions, because this leaves the Japanese the initiative, which is really bad. Because basically, just like Rommel on the Atlantic Wall, you have to guard everything, but the Japanese can pick and choose when they want to fight and where. So, this is really not a good situation, and a lot of the U.S. Admiralty actually points this out, but because of the political situation back in Washington, they can't really do anything about it without aggravating the Japanese, which is also not good. So they're just kind of stuck in this kind of limbo between trying to be prepared for an attack and also trying to keep the Japanese from thinking that they're actually starting to, get onto this, starting to catch on to what the Japanese are doing. And so by November and first couple days of December, the U.S. knows, okay, the attack is coming. We have lots of information pointing at the Japanese, just saying, we've got all this information. We know that the Japanese attack is coming in the next few weeks, if not the next few days. We don't know where, we don't know when. Because, unbeknownst to the Japanese, back in Washington, the code breakers of the U.S. Cryptological Service have actually broken the Japanese diplomatic code. They haven't broken the Navy's code, which is a lot harder to break. But they have broken the diplomatic code. And they hear, early on December 7th, in Washington, because, on December 7th in Hawaii, but midday Washington, that the Japanese, a message to the ambassadors comes. And it says something along these lines, that you are to break off all negotiations with the United States and prepare to pack up your bags and leave the capital. The U.S. intercepts this message, and this goes straight up, right up to the top brass in the Pentagon. And they immediately transmit a telegram to Hawaii saying that an attack is coming. Now, because of the nature of telegrams, this telegram is supposed it leaves Washington at around 7 a.m. Hawaii time, or just before then. But because of the nature of telegrams, and because of weather patterns, they couldn't actually send a radio message. Because of the nature of telegrams, this telegram is only going to reach Honolulu at around 11 a.m., near noon, which, at that point, the attack will have already happened. Now, early in the morning, December 7th, focusing now on Hawaii, the Japanese fleet, meanwhile, all this time, has started moving. And they've moved out along the northern rim of the Pacific and down towards the north and east of the Hawaiian Islands. And they're only a couple hundred miles away from Honolulu at this point. They launch their fighters. And also, there's a submarine group attached, which launches 4 midget subs, each crewed by 2 people with 2 torpedoes and suicide charges. These are deployed a few miles out from Honolulu itself, outside the harbor. So, planes are inbound, 4 midget subs are inbound, and the U.S. in Washington doesn't know, but we'll find out later in the morning, due to some clever guesswork and some cryptology and some amazing cryptography and all that. And then, meanwhile, in the U.S. Fleet Command at Pearl, they also are unaware of these goings on. The past few days, they've been receiving reports of submarines. They've been receiving reports of weird Japanese activity in the region. And just because of all this fake news, so-called, the fleet commanders have been really desensitized to receiving reports about all this stuff, which will become crucial in the ensuing attack. So, early in the morning on December 7th, or actually, important note, so a couple days earlier, Admiral William Halsey, who will become famous later in the war for his actions at battles like Midway and the Battle of the Coral Sea, he asks permission to take the carriers out, all 4 of them, on exercises outside the harbor. This permission is granted, which means that the main target of the Japanese attack, the carriers, is now out at sea, nowhere to be found by the Japanese. The Japanese don't know this, but because they've got all these backup plans, they're still ready to go and do as much damage as possible. At 3:42 in the morning, the minesweeper Condor detects, or outside the entrance of Pearl Harbor, in their designated grid square, where they're supposed to patrol for enemy submarines or something of the sort, sees a periscope above the water. They report it to this destroyer, the USS Ward, which is close by, and the USS Ward moves in to try and sink this sub. Now, the commander on board the Ward has only been in command of his ship 2 days, and really has no luck seeing the sub until he sees something in the water and opens up on it with everything he has, guns, everything, and eventually sees the sub drop below the surface. He presumes it's sinking, but wants to make sure, and drops a full salvo of depth charges on top of the submarine. These are the first Japanese casualties of World War II due to American fire. So, the Ward sends back a message to Pearl saying, we've encountered a sub, we've engaged it, and we've sunk it, presumably. And the commander emphasized in the message, we have engaged it, to kind of differentiate the reports from his report from the reports of the previous days, which said, we've seen a sub, we haven't engaged it, and we don't know where it is. So, that way, he hopes the Admiralty will see this and go, oh, this is serious. We have to actually put the whole base on alert. Now, back in Pearl, the people receiving the messages at the radio station see this message, decode it, and then because of standard operating procedure, they paraphrase it. And in the paraphrasing, don't really emphasize all this stuff that's going on with, we've actually engaged this sub. So, when this message reaches the Admiral, he just hears, oh, it's another sub report. Don't mind that. It's probably fake. There's probably no sub out there. And so, with this, the first report that the U.S. has to actually confirm an attack on Pearl Harbor goes unnoticed. Later in the morning, after the Ward incident, Japanese subs still headed towards the mouth of the harbor. Japanese commander Mitsuo Fujita, in charge of the actual air assault, scrambles his planes and starts heading towards Hawaii. About the same time was when the Ward actually started engaging the Japanese midget sub. And about the same time was when the message that from the Ward got to U.S. High Command at Pearl Harbor, and they did nothing. A little bit later, at 07:02 hours of the day, in military time, or 7:02 in the morning for normal people, a Army radar station at Opana Point on Oahu sees on the radar screen a sizable formation of what looks to be bombers. And the radar operators, radar is still a kind of new technology. The British had the best radars. The Americans didn't have quite as good radars. Once the Americans did join the war, after this, the Americans got, as part of the Tizard mission, the British radar technology, and American radar was significantly improved because of it. But at this point, American radar was vastly inferior to anything the British had, and the Japanese had even better radar than the Americans. And these radar operators, because they're rookies, because radar is such a new thing, see this huge blip. They've never seen a blip on the radar this big. A formation of 50 bombers, according to the size. And the guy at the radio, at the radar, looking at the screen, he's never seen anything like this before. He looks over to the other private next to him, says, "Hey, come take a look at this." And they both agree that they should report it. And they report it to Fort Shafter, which is the information hub on Oahu. So this is the same place that the Ward's message went through to get to High Command, or the Navy's equivalent of it. And they send this message back to the U.S. Army Information Center. And after the guy at the at the Information Center reads this message, he assumes, based on intelligence that he has, that it's a flight of US B-17s bound for the Philippines, with making stops at Oahu and other US bases on the way. So he sends the message back, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's probably nothing." Of course, he doesn't tell them that he thinks it's B-17s because that's classified information. So the U.S. radar people are eventually just pack up their stuff and head back towards Honolulu, with just in the back of their minds, okay, it's probably nothing. So the second chance that the United States had to get ready their defenses and possibly do significant damage to the Japanese carrier Air Force is also thwarted by sheer ignorance. And in my opinion, this can be somewhat forgiven, but also is completely unacceptable. Because, on the one hand, the United States previously, their radar technology is flimsy at best. So, it could be a freaking flight of seagulls. Nobody knows. Also, these privates may have misinterpreted it. So, the people at the Information Center could have thought, hey, these guys are rookies at this. They might just be overreacting. Thirdly, because there was an expected flight of B-17s, they could easily mistake that. 50 bombers versus 17 B-17s. So, because of all these factors together combined with the constant false alarms in the days prior, leads to this kind of indecision in the U.S. command chain. And so word of this sighting never reaches U.S. High Command until the attack on Pearl Harbor has already happened. And after this, one of the interesting things that comes out of the whole deal with Pearl Harbor was the U.S. significantly changed its military policy in dealing with information like this. It was one of the greatest things to come out of Pearl Harbor, other than the fact that the United States is now in World War II and can now save the world according to, United States propaganda, right? But it was really the reforms brought about by Pearl Harbor that really, this event rocked the military to its core and really brought about much needed change that was not going to happen with any other kind of event besides this major attack. So, again, second time, this information reaches headquarters, but, this information doesn't even reach headquarters. It reaches the information center, where it's just stopped dead cold. It doesn't get any farther than that. Meanwhile, the U.S. Admiral, Husband Kimmel, is in charge of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now hears at 07:15 the ward's message, and again, just makes nothing of it. Probably just wait for verification, all that stuff, all the Army bureaucracy. And all this information, even to untrained eyes, all this information coming in at the same time, because all of this stuff, the sightings by the Ward and the Cobra, the sinking of the Japanese midget submarine, and the spotting of a huge formation of planes on the very outer edge of your radar sighting capability, all this stuff is coming in right around 7 o'clock. Even to untrained eyes, you can see that something is not right here. You wouldn't be hearing reports of a sunken Japanese submarine along with reports of a huge fleet of aircraft. You wouldn't be hearing these at the same time if it was fake. You wouldn't. There's no way that something like this, by chance, would happen, just to be a false alarm. So, there's a lot of stuff happening at U.S. High Command that is, and really low command too, because it's the people at the actual information center that don't really spread the information as effectively as they should have, which is where a lot of the reforms came in. You're now, or after this event, it's now mandatory to bring this information up the chain of command. But unfortunately, those protocols were not there, which led to some of the drastic consequences that happened during the actual battle, during the actual engagement. Meanwhile, back in Washington, for a change, the codebreakers, right? They've now kind of gathered all this information. They've sent out the telegram. And now, the Japanese in Washington, the ambassadors, have actually decoded their message slower than the U.S. codebreakers have actually decoded the Japanese message, which is kind of funny if you think about it. So the Japanese ambassadors, this message that the Japanese have sent, to break off all diplomatic ties, it also includes to deliver a formal warning to the United States. They're instructed to bring it to the United States at 1 o'clock, I believe it is, p.m. Washington time. I believe approximately 30 minutes to an hour before the attack, to say, hey, we're at war now. Just, by the way, we're at war. So, because it's part of the Japanese honor code to never really ambush an enemy. Now, because it takes so long for these Japanese ambassadors to actually decode this message, they only decode it after the deadline has already been passed for them to deliver the message to the U.S. government that they are now at war. So, the Japanese never intended for this to be a surprise attack. But, because of their own ambassadors being slow to decode the message, the formal warning never reached the United States government on time. Which made this whole attack much, much greater in its kind of uniting effect of this isolationist democracy into this powerhouse, this arsenal of the world, just igniting the flame of freedom, as some people would call it. If this had not been a surprise attack, even though by military standards an hour's warning is not that much, I mean, today it's a heck of a lot, but back then, getting a message from Washington to Hawaii, as I already said, is a lot harder than just sending an email to the guy saying, "Hey, get your fighters ready. We got an attack coming in." But so it would take at least a couple hours for the U.S. to warn the base in Hawaii, so it would still be a surprise attack. So at 0740, the Japanese planes, 49 high-altitude bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 torpedo planes, and 43 fighters all enter Hawaiian airspace. This entire time, they've actually been listening to Hawaiian radio for weather reports, accurate weather reports, which is, when you think about it, that's really ingenious to listen to the island's own weather reports for your accurate weather. And they've also been been listening to Hawaiian music radio stations, all that like native Hawaiian stuff. They've been listening to that to get a homing beacon where the source of these radio signals are coming from, so that they can actually trace it back to Oahu, so that they can navigate using this radio. And this entire formation of Japanese planes enters Hawaiian airspace, and Mitsuo Fuchida, once he sees that nothing is happening, no planes have scrambled, the fleet's not exiting the harbor, because there's perfect visibility. Basically, there's light clouds above the mountains, according to the Hawaiian radio, which is correct, and no clouds anywhere else. So Fuchida sees the entire fleet arrayed in front of him at Anchorage in Pearl Harbor, and tells his operator in the back to wire a message back to the carriers, saying, "Tora, Tora, Tora," which means attack, surprise, achieved. Now, some of the Japanese fighter pilots would actually confuse this for the Japanese word Tora, which means tiger. And so you can see how it would be kind of a morale boosting thing to say Tora, 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 tiger, 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 and go in and try and kill the Americans. So just one of those kind of interesting stories about the Japanese side in Pearl Harbor, which you almost never really hear about, because it's all usually it's kind of an interesting perspective, right? The U.S., when looking back on Pearl Harbor, almost always blames itself for everything that happened, with good reason. As I was talking about earlier, even, just the failure to notice all these signs, this kind of collection of data points on the graph. draw some of your own conclusions, and the lack of cohesion with the chain of command and all that. It was really, if the U.S. had done everything right, which is, that's best case scenario the U.S. would have had. The best the U.S. could have hoped for was to maybe scramble some of their fighters. But that would be a heck of a lot better than what happened. So a lot of the U.S. is kind of like here at home. We put a lot of the blame on ourselves, which is true. But also, don't forget the Japanese are basically just launching a surprise attack here. We shouldn't have had to expect a Japanese attack, even though. But anyway, back to the actual historical stuff. So, at 0750, the Japanese planes start coming in for their attack runs. And at the command center on Ford Island, Commander Logan C. Ramsey sees a low-flying plane. Thinks, oh, this is some reckless U.S. pilot. Hey, get down from there. Go land. I'm going to court-martial you. Then he sees a tiny black object fall from the bottom of this plane and realizes it's a bomb. And he immediately messages every ship in the base and says, air raid on Pearl Harbor X. This is not drill. The attack on Pearl Harbor has begun. So the Japanese planes start coming in. The midget subs all this time are still kind of making their way into the harbor. One of them has already been sunk. Another is going to be sunk as well. And the other two are unaccounted for. Presumably one lost at sea just due to maybe some incident or something. Batteries ran out or something. One reportedly actually makes it into the harbor and fires a torpedo, but then nothing is really heard of it again. So no one really knows. So the Japanese are starting to bomb the ships in Pearl Harbor, and because it's a Sunday morning, many of the sailors are actually just, since it's a Sunday, are on just kind of resting. You're at peacetime. It's a Sunday in Hawaii. It's beautiful out. And many of the sailors are just kind of relaxing on the decks. The band, plays Reveille or whatever at 0800 for the flag to come up. And there's actually a really interesting scene in the movie Tora Tora Tora, which is a really good movie. I would highly recommend it, where the band is actually playing when the Japanese planes fly in. And so they quickly have to finish up the song and raise the flag and then get to their battle stations. But the U.S. fleet is caught completely off guard. They've got no warning, except for the Admiralty, which just ignores it. And most of them are just in their kind of regular outfits, not in their battle clothes, kind of. And most of them are far away from their battle stations. So when the alarm is actually sounded, there's a lot of scrambling that has to be done on the part of the U.S. sailors to get to their battle stations. Now, at 0810 hours, one of the most famous kind of things at the Battle of Pearl Harbor, which the picture of is actually on the screen, happens. An armor-piercing bomb dropped by one of the high-altitude bombers lands and penetrates the deck armor of the USS Arizona and hits the magazine, explodes in there, setting off more than 1 million pounds. If you're from Europe, that's 450,000 kilograms of gunpowder. Huge explosion. Huge. Just a massive explosion. You could probably hear this thing for 20, 30, 40 miles. Massive explosion. This much gunpowder has not gone off at once, I don't think, ever before. So, massive explosion. the Arizona, the USS Arizona, a huge World War I era battleship, skyrockets up at least 15 or 20 feet, according to the eyewitness testimony, which, if you're from Europe, is 5 or 6 meters, out of the water, and then slams back in. And from the motion that it makes while it's in the air, it looks like it's been split in two because the magazine hit severs the ship in half. And in less than 10 minutes, the USS Arizona is at the bottom of the harbor, taking with her 1,177 sailors. The largest amount, and that's just like, that's killed. That's not even casualties, that's killed. Out of a ship that probably only has 2,500 sailors on board, over half of, or almost half of them, are killed, let alone injured. Most of the rest are going to be injured because of the nature of sinkings. Oil slicks, spills, all that kind of stuff. Ships, the pieces of the ship collapsing and falling into the water could have even crushed a couple people, or something like that. And because in the picture you can see that some of the water is on fire because the oil has been set on fire and is leaking. And the oil on the inside the stores of the USS Arizona is still leaking to this day. I believe the Park Service says it's going to run out of oil to leak in a few years, but 76 years later, it's still bubbling up to the surface. So, you know, just kind of a solemn reminder of the past there. And the USS Arizona Memorial is probably one of the most somber places in U.S. in kind of the U.S. ring of monuments for World War II, because no other United States monument sits on top of a tomb for 1,177 people. No other U.S. monument. The Omaha Beach Cemetery is the only one that really can compare. Arlington is not just from World War II, so, you know, like, that's kind of on its own level. But the USS Arizona, all stuck inside that wreckage. There for pretty much eternity, really. So, yeah, just kind of a solemn reminder of what happened there. And so, besides the Arizona, all these other ships in the harbor are starting to man their battle stations and starting to return fire. Most of the fire is ineffective because most, if not all, of these sailors have never seen combat before. It's only a few of the officers that have served for a long time that even remember a glimpse of World War I naval combat. And, as you may know, in World War I, there were really not that many naval engagements. There was one at the Battle of Jutland, and that was the biggest. That was the only really big fleet-sized engagement, and that was prior to the U.S. involvement in World War I. So most of these commanders are very inexperienced when it comes to actual battle, and all the sailors have never seen combat before. Never. Probably half of them have never even used the guns in anger at any target whatsoever. So the U.S. fleet was pretty much doomed from the start because this Japanese force attacking them, they're all veterans of these campaigns in China and in Manchuria and all that, flying support missions for the military down there. And these U.S. ships are starting to try, and each of them on their own initiative is trying to find some way to try and avoid the chaos and slaughter that is happening inside this kind of bottleneck of a harbor. So, a destroyer called the USS Helm spots outside the harbor channel a midget sub and sinks it. So this is the second midget submarine that sinks. One of the crew members presumably drowns with the submarine. The other actually makes it out and onto the land. And that Japanese sailor from the midget sub becomes the first prisoner of war that the U.S. takes during World War II. So just kind of an interesting the destroyer. Let's see. What I'm looking at a kind of timeline here that I've prepared. Uh, hmm. Yeah. So the USS Nevada, one of the battleships in Battleship Row, I believe that was 8 battleships there, is the only battleship to actually get underway during the attack. And the USS Nevada would later participate in D-Day, in the D-Day landings, and as part of the offshore bombardment, which I'm sure I'll talk about more when we do the D-Day episode for the World War II podcast. She heads for the open sea, so she makes her way to the harbor entrance. The Japanese planes spot her and start trying to focus her down, because if they can shoot her when she is in the midst of the harbor entrance and sink her, none of the other U.S. ships are going to be able to make it out of the harbor for weeks until they clear out that wreck. So the skipper of the ship, notices this, and by the order of the captain, steers the ship aground and runs it aground on Hospital Point, so that way it doesn't block the entrance to the harbor if it gets hit. Now, spoilers already given because of its participation on D-Day. It manages to survive the it manages to survive the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it is one of the least kind of damaged ships of the U.S. fleet there. The second wave of fighters at this point, at 08:54 hours, just to kind of give you a sense. So the attack has only been going on for about 50 minutes, and already all this stuff has happened. Ships are blowing up left and right. Japanese planes are strafing the airfields. Hickam Field, the main airfield for the American Naval Air Wing there and the Army Air Force, has been strafed. The planes were lying out on the runway, wings folded up if they had foldable wings. So the Japanese were just able to shoot them, and I think maybe 2 or 3 U.S. planes made it into the air total during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and I think shot down maybe 5 planes of the Japanese. I think 24 planes were shot down, 19 by flak fire, and 4 or 5 by the actual U.S. Army Air Force with their F-4F Wildcat fighters. So the second wave comes in. This consisted of 35 fighters, 78 dive bombers, and 54 high-altitude bombers. And this time, the U.S. fleet is somewhat ready, and so they actually start meeting some heavier anti-aircraft fire. The first wave takes virtually no casualties, but the second wave is where most of the casualties start mounting up. And this time the bombers actually attack the dry dock, and they hit the battleship Pennsylvania, kind of knocking it out. Another bomber hits the fuel tanks between the destroyers Cassine and Downs, and the onboard ammunition explodes. And the Cassine rolls off her blocks in the dry dock and actually slams into the Downs, creating even more chaos. And some bombs also hit the light cruiser Raleigh, which had been torpedoed in the first wave, and so the crew members are tossing stuff off the sides to actually keep her from capsizing, unlike one of the ships at D-Day, I believe, or not D-Day, the Pearl Harbor, sorry. I believe the USS Oklahoma actually turtled, so the bottom side, the hull of the ship actually flips over, and the ship is now with its hull out of the water, and it's what is supposed to be the deck underwater. A bomb also blows the bow off of the destroyer Shaw, and this creates a huge explosion. One of and this explosion is actually captured on photograph. and it becomes one of the most famous pictures of the actual um, December 7th attacks. And so, just kind of one of those interesting stories again. So the Shah would actually later get repaired, and by 1942 would fight for the U.S. fleet again. An interesting note, except for the Arizona, Utah, and Oklahoma, every single ship sunk or damaged on the Pearl Harbor attacks will actually sail again for the U.S. fleet. So, just kind of shows you the effort that the Americans put into repairing their ships. Japanese second wave takes, that hits as many targets as they can. Again, they're disappointed that the carriers aren't there, but they can still do as much damage as they possibly can. And they hit their targets, and they rendezvous back up, and following the bombers, because the fighters and dive bombers didn't actually have radio, the high-altitude bombers did have radio and radar. Following the high-altitude bombers, they headed back for the carrier fleet. So the Japanese consider launching a third wave, which was planned, and which was supposed to be executed with some new planes and some remnants of the first wave. This plan is actually ultimately rejected because the Japanese feel that they've accomplished all that they really wanted to do. This is also one of those points where people claim the Japanese could have done better and actually launched the third wave to potentially knock out some of the oil tanks in Pearl to diminish drastically the United States supplies there, so that the Pacific Fleet couldn't actually get underway for a long time. Out of Hawaii, they'd have to wait for more fuel to get there. And again, it's a debate that I am no Pearl Harbor expert by any means. So I'm just going to leave that to your own investigation, whether or not they should have done that. So the Japanese attack is over, and all sorts of ships, aircraft, and infrastructure in Oahu has just been severely damaged. All 3 airports on the island have been ambushed and attacked. Most of the planes at each of them have been shot down or just shot up on the airfield. A lot of the U.S. Pacific Fleet is at the bottom of the harbor or severely damaged. And 2,390 U.S. sailors are dead. This attack is one of the single deadliest days in human history. Or in American history, not just human history. In American history more so than human history. The only thing afterwards that compares is D-Day on Omaha Beach, 2,500 dead, and the 9/11 attacks with over 3,000. But this is by far not the deadliest day in American history. That was in the Civil War, the Battle of Antietam. Over the course of a single day, September 17th, 1862, 17,000 people were killed or wounded. Many of them would either die of their wounds later or have to have their limbs amputated. So, yeah, definitely not the bloodiest day, but one of the bloodiest single days in U.S. history that we can actually speak to people who have lived it. And it is just a devastating loss for the U.S. fleet. The Japanese have accomplished most of their goals, except for the carriers. The U.S. fleet, according to them, is kaput. Everything except for the carriers is pretty much out of action. Most of the battleships are damaged beyond repair, or so the Japanese would think, or sunk. A lot of the cruisers, destroyers, and other support ships have been heavily damaged. Everything except for the carriers. And this would just show later on in the war the effectiveness of carriers over that of battleships. The Japanese commanders were highly satisfied with the raid on Pearl Harbor because they had destroyed most of the U.S. capital ships, the battleships. But, as they would soon learn, to their detriment, carriers were the new top dogs in naval warfare. And them not being able to destroy the carriers would be a deciding factor in the naval engagements to come. And in the 44 months that will follow, every single one of the Japanese aircraft carriers and battleships and cruisers in the strike force will be sunk. That before the end of the war. And on September 2nd, 1945, among the U.S. warships in Tokyo Bay is the USS West Virginia, one of the battleships in Battleship Row. Over the following days, or over the following weeks to a couple months, the U.S. will launch a massive effort to repair all of the ships and aircraft and other weapons of war, and they will repair everything except for the Arizona, Oklahoma, and Utah, which is amazing because one of the ships, I believe because one of the ships has been capsized, right? So it's amazing they've managed to flip it over. And on December 8th, on December 8th, 1941, because all this was happening late in the evening. So late December 7th, early morning, December 8th. President Roosevelt arrives at the capital of the United States. And he is accompanied by his son, who is a captain in the Marine Corps. And he enters the House of Representatives. But this time, it's a joint session with both the House, the Senate, observers from all different branches of government, and spectators in the galleries from all sorts of walks of civilian life. And he is given a unanimous round of applause by everybody there. And before this, the Republicans had never given him a round of applause at a joint session of Congress. They hated his guts. They did. And it just shows that after such a traumatic event like this, everybody was on the same page. Even if they might have had some political differences before, they had a much bigger problem in front of them, and that was the Empire of Japan. And so, after a brief introduction by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, President Roosevelt gives one of the most famous speeches in all of World War II history. And I just happen to have that speech here for you, which I'll play the video of. So if you're watching this on YouTube, then you'll be able to actually see the video along with it. And that's where I'm going to end it here. So, without any further ado, please just sit back and listen to one of the greatest speeches that World War II history has to offer. And I'm sure that it'll be a great listen. It's always good to hear inspirational men speak such things, And it's one of the critical speeches that changes the direction of World War II in the favor of the Allies. Because it is one of the most significant speeches in all of human history, really. But so just don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more, and be sure to stay tuned for the World War II podcast when it comes. So I'll just let President Franklin Delano Roosevelt take us out. So see y'all later.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.